Hi everyone, and welcome to the review for the material for Section 8 for the HTML5 exam. So, we've finished up so far our discussion on HTML5, which controls the basic content for your web page, and CSS, which controls the look and feel, and provides all the fancy ways of styling and making our web pages look pretty. But today we're going to move on to talking about the part that makes web pages interactive. So the fun part, the part where we actually do our animations and we can draw things on the screen. And that's JavaScript. So let's start by looking at some basic overview of the concepts for JavaScript. So the first thing to note is that JavaScript is the final leg of the three key web technologies that we have. So along with HTML5 and CSS, these are standardized by the World Wide Web Consortium to actually manage all of the look and feel of just about everything that we see on the internet. Even if we use fancy server applications, everything that we see is controlled by one of these three technologies. So let's start by talking about what JavaScript is. So unlike HTML and CSS, JavaScript is actually a full programming language. So it's interesting in that it is interpreted. So JavaScript provides a list of instructions for the browser to actually perform actions using the web page sort of as its source material. But it actually functions just like any of the other programming languages that we've worked with. So they all sort of share a lot of similar concepts. So we use JavaScript as a programming language to create dynamic websites. So when we use static HTML and CSS, we're just defining static presentation. Nothing really changes. We have a few tricks in CSS, but for the most part, we can't do anything fancy. But JavaScript is actually a program that runs on the client's computer, and it can make changes even if nothing's connected to the internet by modifying the web page after it's been downloaded. So it's pretty cool. And we'll talk about how it does it in just a second. But let's actually start by talking about the structure of JavaScript. So the material actually goes into a brief review of programming, so some basic programming concepts. I won't touch on these, spend a lot of time on these since we already should be certified in programming, but I'll talk about how they relate to JavaScript. So JavaScript uses all of the basic control structures that we used. So we can use for loops, we can use while loops, we can create branches, we can do fancy things like switch blocks, and we have a lot of other features. We talked about some of the more advanced JavaScript features when we were doing the full material in this section, where JavaScript can actually be used as an object-oriented language, or more specifically, a prototype language. But we'll start with the basics. The material that we have starts by talking about functions, because it's one of the good key features of any programming language. You don't want to reuse code. I love this term from Python, and Python has something called the DRY principle, and it's an acronym for don't repeat yourself. And if you ever find yourself writing similar code more than once, turn it into a function. And that's what we'll talk about. So the first main piece of JavaScript are functions. And a function, as you should know from our methods in C#, is actually just a block of code that we can reuse. We give it a name, we give it the actual code or lines of code to execute, and that's called the function body. And then we give it a list of options or parameters, and those can be called parameters or arguments. So in addition to using functions to sort of reuse code and actually define a bunch of different actions that are sort of our palette for building good, well-organized applications, we typically have to interact with data. I know I said this a long time ago, but it still remains true. Everything we do is interacting with data. And in the context of JavaScript, mostly we're interacting with a web page, which, as we know, HTML is just text. It's all data. So one of the basic ways of interacting with data is actually this concept of storing data in variables. So the idea behind a variable is that we can actually store any sort of data inside of a named location in memory. So if we need to remember a number or we need to perform some operation on, say, someone's name, we store it in a variable somewhere. So we can go back and reference it, and we may do some actions, say replace all instances of the letter L with the letter G. And we can store the result in a different variable, so we can keep track of all of our data. So we talked about that at length previously, so I won't go into much detail, but the one thing to note about variables in JavaScript is that we have some restrictions on what we can use for their names. So variables need to be either variables need to contain only letters, numbers, underscores, or the $sign. But the first character can't be a number, and we also can't use what are called reserved keywords. So these are any of the keywords that we actually use as part of our programming. So if or else or the function keyword or break. We can't reuse any of those because if we made a variable with that name, it would sort of mess up the internal structure of JavaScript. Things will break. It will get ugly. So they're restricted. And we'll actually see in a second the special use case for this $sign character is actually redefined when we start talking about jQuery. So jQuery is actually a JavaScript library. It's probably one of the first and most widely used libraries for JavaScript, and it's really convenient. So when we were doing our full discussion of JavaScript, we saw that actually interacting with some pieces of the HTML document object model gets very verbose. So if we ever want to do anything to, say, one paragraph of text, we have to get it by its ID, and there's a very verbose statement for that. Not only that, but we're actually restricted in what we can actually select and perform operations on. So we have to make some very complex loops, we have to create some special functions, and it takes a lot of time. So there's a more efficient way to do this, and jQuery sort of takes a lot of these base level efficiency improvements and rolls them into a single library that we all have access to. So the core of jQuery is actually based around this special function that we have that allows us to select items as if they were CSS selectors. So this special $sign function is actually redefined in jQuery. And we use this function sort of as a replacement for our document.getElementById function, the very verbose version. And what it does is it allows us to select a range of different tags from our HTML and perform an operation on all of them in one statement. It also provides a lot of shortcuts for things like modifying the inner HTML of an element, or replacing an element, or adding a new tag to a page, or changing attributes. And it also provides a lot of shortcuts for attaching JavaScript to HTML events. We'll talk more about events in just a second, but the biggest one that we talked about was actually using our document.ready event. And what this does is it actually allows us to sort of queue up all of our JavaScript to wait and execute when the document is finished loading. Because we've seen through some of our examples that if we have a piece of JavaScript that executes sort of before an element is actually drawn, then that JavaScript will fail. So we have to be careful where we put JavaScript in our HTML documents. And jQuery provides us this nice shortcut to just say, all right, it doesn't really matter where you put it, it'll always happen at the end, so everything will already be drawn and everything will happen in the order you expect. So jQuery is hosted in a number of different locations, but it's actually just another script file. And we can import it using our basic HTML JavaScript import tag, the same way we would our own custom JavaScripts. So we use this script tag with a source attribute, and we give it a URL. And we saw last time when we were talking about this that we can actually use a version of this that's hosted on a content delivery network like Google APIs. So it keeps it up to date, it has high uptime, and it also provides some really interesting advantages. because browsers cache things. If a lot of different websites use the same library with the same URL, everyone's loads faster because it's probably cached from another website when they show up to yours. So it's a really good speed bonus. So we we typically use jQuery in all of our JavaScript. So while jQuery isn't actually part of base vanilla JavaScript, it's actually so widely used that some people forget to make this distinction. But for the purposes of this material, it seems like they sort of treat JavaScript and JavaScript with jQuery as sort of the same thing. But it's good to know the distinctions. We will continue as the book does for this and sort of assume that it's all part of the same block. But just note that anytime you sort of see this special dollar sign function, that we're talking about a special jQuery thing that's not part of base JavaScript. So we'll start by talking about how we use JavaScript sort of in our web pages. And the main idea, as I mentioned before, is actually to create interactive applications. So CSS is really great for drawing things and making them look pretty. But with JavaScript, we actually can take this a step further and make things like animations or actually interact with the user through dialogues. And one of the really important things that we can do with this is actually form validation. So when the user enters some information into a web form, say a phone number, JavaScript can actually go through the process of checking to make sure it's valid, checking the formatting. If we have any specific area code restrictions or country code restrictions, we can do all of that before the user ever clicks a submit button or before the user ever has to wait on a page to load. It can happen almost instantly. So that's sort of some of the uses of JavaScript. But one of the best things that we need to pay attention to is actually how we launch these. So we can run JavaScript just sort of when the browser loads or when the document finishes loading and have it do some sort of action. But that's not quite as interesting as the way we typically use JavaScript. So when we're making web pages, we actually typically create JavaScript that gets launched in a callback. And these callbacks are usually from what are called HTML events. So we talked about events in the context of Windows Forms previously, and the idea is very similar. So it's sort of a programmatic way to respond to a user's action. So there's some predefined things that the browser pays attention to. And whenever one of those things happens, it can actually call a piece of our own custom code. That code that gets called is a callback. So we may have a callback for a button click event for a specific button. And we can specify specific code that gets executed. So when we build these events, we typically refer to the actual browser behavior that links the user action to sort of this programmatic event as the event handler. So the user, say, clicks a button, the event handler fires, and it says, hey, they did click this, they did click the right button. Let's see if there's a callback for it. And if there's a callback, it will call our JavaScript. And all of that's sort of transparent. It's built-in functionality for the browser. We typically assume that it works, and it works well, and we are sort of at the mercy of the browser anyway in those cases. So that's sort of the structure that we use to launch most of our JavaScript. And we have a bunch of different events that we can respond to. So I think I've already mentioned that we can respond to a button click, but just about every HTML element, from paragraph tags to header tags to tables to buttons to especially our input form elements, has their own set of events that they will actually respond to. And these are actually defined in our documentation on W3 Schools. We don't need to know all of them exhaustively. We typically look them up when we need them. But it's good to know some of the basic ones that we have available to us. So some of the ones that happen a lot are we usually respond to clicking or the mouse moving. So we have different events for dealing with that. So if something is clicked on, we actually get three different events that fire, and all three of them happen. So we get our mouse down event, which is when the user pushes the mouse button down. We get a mouse up event when the user lets it go. And we also get a mouse click event, or I think it's just a click event for HTML, that actually is an event for that whole cycle of actions. We also have we have events for the double click, and we also have events for moving the mouse and dragging and dropping different elements or files on the page. So, in addition to dealing with the mouse, which is probably the most important, let's be real, no one really ever navigates the internet using anything other than that unless they have to. But in addition to interacting with the mouse, we can also interact with our keyboard. So if someone is typing information into a text box, we can respond to specific key presses. We can respond to highlighting where you select portions of the text. We can respond, excuse me, we can respond specifically to things like someone presses enter to submit some text in a text box. We can also respond to some very specific things. So selecting an item in a radio menu list, or selecting an item from a drop-down. Those have specific events that are associated with them. And we also have some other some other events that affect sort of the page in general. So we have our body onload event, which sort of happens when everything in our body tag is finished loading. So our entire document sort of shows up on the page. We can then execute some JavaScript. So this body onload event is actually one of the more interesting events that we have. And typically what happens is, pre-jQuery anyway, is that we actually put all of our JavaScript inside of a special function. Maybe it's called initialize. And we always fire that on the body's onload event. So if you're following along in the book, on page 204, there's an example. And you can see that here we create basically an initialize event, and we call it when the body onload event gets fired. So basically what we're doing is this event will happen when our body is finished loading all of the HTML, so that we can call a function that sets up our JavaScript after our HTML is finished loading. And we know, because we've already experienced jQuery, that we have a similar function that we use to sort of accomplish the same thing. So one of the other key things that you probably want to do when you're building interactive pages is the ability to basically turn pieces of the page on and off. And JavaScript allows you to do that. So each element, as we should be familiar with, has a display CSS property. And we know by default that the two ways of displaying things are either inline or block. So it either has some built-in line breaks before and after it, or it doesn't. But the display property also has a few other options. One of these is display none, which basically removes the item from being shown. And we can change that with JavaScript. So with JavaScript, we can access our HTML's document object model. And inside of this, not only do we have sort of this programmatic list of every element and every tag and every attribute in our page, we have programmatic access to all of the CSS styles for those as well. So, quite simply, we can actually go in, find an element, and change its style display property to either none or back to block if we want to turn an element on or off. And it's pretty cool. And this actually becomes really important when we're talking about modern web development. So a lot of web pages that you see today are what are called single page applications. And these applications sort of work by sort of having all of your web page sort of somewhere in the background in JavaScript and just showing or hiding different sections of your website. So sort of think of like a tabbed interface where, at the top of your screen you may have a bunch of different tabs like your browser. And you can click to change them. There's no real loading. Things just sort of pop up when you change tabs. You can sort of accomplish that by creating, different sections of your website that get shown or hidden when you click different links in JavaScript. And that's sort of the basis of modern web development. So the next time you're on a website, maybe like Mint or something, where it has sections, take a look at the loading times. Typically what you will see is that when you click on a link, your browser doesn't actually navigate anywhere. So your screen doesn't go white and you don't have the browser loading bar at the bottom. Typically what happens is you may see a custom loading icon pop up in the middle of the screen, and then your web page will change, but your URL will not update because your page never really navigated anywhere. So it's really important to pay attention to. That sort of managing that whole process is actually a whole nother topic that we'll hopefully get to after the certification. But this is sort of the foundational knowledge of a lot of these single page applications and the frameworks that support them. So along with the same line of showing and hiding elements, we also have the ability to update and change the content in pretty much all of our HTML tags. So if we say have a table that may have a bunch of different, tax data in it, we can update each individual cell of that table, as long as we know its ID or its class. And we do this by using the inner HTML property. So we can use either JavaScript's getElementById function, or we can use the jQuery selector to select an element. And then we can modify this inner HTML property. And what that allows us to do is basically replace anything inside of that HTML tag with whatever new content that we supply. And we can do this in two different ways. So we can either replace the HTML inside of the page, and then we'll actually be placing new tags inside of our HTML, or we can actually just replace the text. And they have slightly different uses depending on whether or not we want to render the tags that we provide for this property or not. So the final piece in interacting with our web page and sort of, fussing with the layout a bit is that we can actually create just new elements arbitrarily and add them to existing elements. So we have two special functions to support this in JavaScript, and that's our create element function and our append child function. And what these basically allow us to do are create an arbitrary element. So when we use our create element, it just creates a new element. It's not placed anywhere yet. It's just sort of existing in a variable somewhere. And we can use the append child property for some other element to actually add this newly created element to this selected child element. So it's a two-step process. We can create anything, let's say a new paragraph tag, and if we want to put that in our article tag, we simply select our article tag using one of our normal selectors, and we append child this newly created paragraph tag, and it'll show up in our document. And that's pretty much it. Along with these, it's not necessarily listed in our book, but we do have some functions to remove elements as well. And these are listed pretty exhaustively in our W3 Schools reference, but we've actually already went over a lot of these. We've also talked about the jQuery equivalents for these. jQuery provides a slightly different way to actually append childs and remove childs that perform slightly more advanced operations. So we can either insert a child at the beginning of all of the sub-elements or at the end of all of the sub-elements, or we can specify what order to put it in. So we have a little bit more control using jQuery without having to write our own custom JavaScript to control the order. So that's sort of the intro to JavaScript. Um, we've basically talked about the basics here. JavaScript is just a programming language. It has a very similar syntax to C Sharp, which we've already talked about, and it actually shares a lot of structural similarities to languages in general. The two distinctions that we have to make with JavaScript versus other languages are that it runs inside of a browser. So it always has access to and knows about the structure of the web page. It's also a interpreted language. It runs sort of in your browser and provides instructions to the browser. So it's not a full program per se, but it does function very much like one. We also talked about using JavaScript libraries to extend the function of JavaScript. So in addition to our basic features that we have provided by the JavaScript language, we also have access to this library called jQuery, which is pretty universally used these days. jQuery actually provides a lot of these good shortcut methods for doing things that we do all the time. So updating elements, selecting elements, changing HTML, inserting new tags, removing old tags. It's sort of all packaged nicely, and it has one other benefit that makes it really powerful, and that is that all of these functions that are inside of jQuery have been written in a way that they are cross-browser compatible. So someone spent a lot of time testing very simple functions across every version of every browser to make sure that there were special cases and if statements to make sure that they work everywhere. So it's really helpful, and we should use these really powerful methods when and where possible. So we also talked about the basic structure and how we can sort of get into building dynamic pages. So we talked about the fact that more or less our JavaScript is event-driven. We have code that responds to specific user actions, and these are called through our HTML events. We sort of create these by making a special event attribute inside of any tag and linking it to a JavaScript function. So all of these functions, when we call them, typically interact with our document object model. And this document object model is our sort of in-memory representation of our web page. And this document object model allows us to do sort of some key functions. And the ones we talked about were quite simply adding and removing elements, updating properties for elements, changing the inner HTML for each of our elements, so updating the content, and what was the other one? And we also have the ability to do some advanced things like validating our forms. So we can use JavaScript to respond to things like form submissions or text changes on inputs. And those are sort of the basics. So JavaScript is sort of, as we can see, a fairly powerful programming language. And it does provide the basis for all of our interactivity across our browser. So in the next two chapters, we'll get into some of the more advanced topics. The next chapter, or lesson 9, is actually the fun one. We get to play around with a lot of our animations and sort of making the cool, really visually powerful and impactful pieces of JavaScript in our web page. And it's always fun to play around with sliding and changing colors, more so than doing arbitrary things like loops. So we'll talk about lesson 9 in the next section of this video series. So thank you, everyone.